Good afternoon. This is Claudette Milner, host of A Matter of Interpretatin, Americans in Crisis. We are going to continue our discussion with Janice Downs regarding violent crimes against our youth. As always, let's go to God in prayer. Most gracious Father, we thank you for the opportunity to be able to help and assist and educate the public on sex crimes. Dear God in heaven, we ask for your guidance, your wisdom, and your knowledge. In Jesus' name we pray, amen. Okay, we're back to discuss the second part. We were talking about grooming. I want to talk about and move on to sex crimes by other figures of authority. The difference between, and pretty much you linked the sex offenders. So we're going to go to the pedophiles, the things that, how the mind works. Because I know you worked counseling pedophiles, and it was sometimes comical how their minds work. So give us some insight into the mind of a sexual predator.
Well, in which, remember, a sexual predator can certainly be, any person who targets a vulnerable person. But a pedophile, that person has a deviant arousal to a particular age group, gender of child. And I wish I could associate it with, because I remember how, there would be many discussions, when we would be counseling a person whose typology was a pedophile, in the sense of that we would associate it with talking with a person who was gay. When they first were trying to come to terms with that orientation. Pedophilia is an orientation. When a person, and we used to talk about how people, when they were so-called in the closet, and the big fear for coming out of the closet was that you would lose the love of your family, of your friends, because they didn't understand that aspect. Whereas for a pedophile, it was the sense of your behavior would be criminal if you acted upon that arousal. And we used to talk about in the sense of when they had the deviant fantasies, for all sexual offenders, no matter what typology, there is the matter of deviant sexual fantasies that a person then engages in, that then of course feeds the arousal that then leads to the acting out of the behavior, okay? And so for a pedophile, it's not where they wanted to be that. And I think it was interesting. It's not that they grew up wanting to be a pedophile. It was that that's where their arousal was to. So part of the treatment was you had to manage the deviant arousal just like you manage any type of addiction to something that's not good for you. But in the cognitive thinking, the distortions that also contributed to the offending was that this child knew what they wanted, knew exactly what they were doing when the acts were being perpetrated against them. That's the mindset of a perpetrator in their cognitive distortions. And it could ever be a sense of being funny, but it amazed me at that. And they would be serious, just like this conversation is serious. One of the things, and one particular incident that sticks out to me when I was working with the sex offenders on parole, was that there would be times when we'd have to interview a person on probation who was placed on probation, or the probation was being determined, by whatever the assessment or evaluation was of a counselor in regards to this person. And this person that I was interviewing at the time, and basically you just get a sense of their background, the relationships that they have, that type of kind of history, establishing the history. And I remember this person talking very frankly with his about his first wife. He was like 20 years old and she was like 14. And I remember him saying that, he saw no distinguishing difference in that age group, a teenager and an adult. And it was a matter of, if a 14-year-old is someone who, we had children, we had sex, just like in any other healthy relationship. But I remember him starting off like that. And then when he got to the point about what happened in the sense of his crime, and he was the neighbor of a person, and they could not make it home in time for when their daughter got off the school bus, so he would be there. I mean, he was an older gentleman, had no reason to suspect that there would be any issue. The child never stated or showed any type of concern. And he said when he would get her off the school bus and fix her lunch, a snack before her mom would get home, and they would sit in the living room and she touched him, and so he just knew she was just as attracted to him as he was to her. And and he was very adamant that there was nothing out of the ordinary about this situation. And I think that, amazed me in a sense, because I thought, how in the world? And could he think that this child had any type of responsibility towards these acts? But yet, to him, he was like, he didn't even understand what all the fuss was about on why, for a child who came on to him, and he simply wanted to make her feel better, and now he was looking at being sentenced for, sexual abuse. And so once, of course, and what ended up happening, of course, after I, issued that assessment and that report to the judge, he didn't get probation. And they basically sent him to prison. And, the thing of it is about, because it is a concern that a person in that mindset would feel that, certainly would be in danger of offending again, because they have no sense of, boundaries. And it's almost like bringing children up to their level of an adult. And it was, and I had to really, that sense of how you engage in treatment with a person like that. And for any type of person or an offender, any typology of an offender, a matter of coming to terms with responsibility is the first one. The very first thing that a person would have to acknowledge, I was the adult, I used this child for my own sexual gratification, and I know that that's something that's wrong that I need to begin to manage. And that's where it has to start with treatment. And for some, they can do it on probation, parole. For others, it needs to start while they're incarcerated.
I can look up any zip code, because I used to look at the 40218 when I used to take Alexandria here to school. And when I would walk her to the bus stop, it wasn't by coincidence, because on the corner was a guy living there who had raped a 2-month-old baby. And yet it seems to me, and we have this disagreement all the time, that they have more rights than I do. That there is more a systematic system that allows for you can't come 100 feet from the school But
And
you
live within
can be,
1,000 feet of a
yeah,
school,
but
yes.
you can be right in front of a bus stop where kids get on and off, and there's no protection for our children. And when I look at that 40218 zip code, which I don't know where I live in, but it's the epitome of that, I can see that there might be 10 sex offenders in that area or more. And so where is the protection for our children? Are we to lock them up inside while the incarcerated or the sex offender has free reign except around the school? It's like you don't have any rights to protect yourself. And then if someone comes into your house, I mean, we had to look at a neighbor one time because we run it. I mean, even, for the protection and coming from a background where I knew what you would call a sex offender. And I had a cousin. I remember having a cousin who passed. And I remember telling my children when we went to on a trip to my grandma's, I said, do not be around this person, and if this person touches you in any way, fame, or form, you come and get me. Because he had been to jail for offending a 12-year-old. He was out and about doing his business, and yet I had to interrupt the vacations to acknowledge that this person is at the family reunion, this person is there, he's a predator, the family knows that he's a sex offender, and yet he's free to migrate around, and I have to keep my kids in hiding or watch them every 2 seconds to make sure that this person does not come in touch. And that infuriates me. And it infuriates me. And I know you're a big proponent of treatment, but there is no cure. And I'm not saying that there are some people that do not manage it. And manage it to the sense of, but when you look at, and I feel like I'm dumping on you because you're Catholic, when you look at the perpetration of the Catholic Church, when you look at the oversight of the church, when you look at the fact that they turn their heads, and it's not illicit to the Catholic Church, it goes to the Baptist Church, the mission, it goes through all of them. But I don't believe that. I think that the reason there are so many sex offenders in the Catholic Church and continues to be, even as they're being sued on a daily basis, it's because of the oversight. And yeah, they just had a big convention, but 100 years later? And all these, and thousands and thousands of years later, that's when they choose to have, a summit on why the Pope overlooked and why the priests overlooked and the bishops overlooked and everybody turned their way because of what? They thought it was better for them to be celibate or to not marry and have access to kids to fit that sexual orientation, that sexual need. I don't fathom it. I don't understand it. I can educate myself into the typologies, and I can say, this is their cognitive thinking, and I can do all that, Janice, I really can, but it infuriates me.
Well, you've touched on so many things, including the question you always ask me is, so how can parents protect their children? But you've incorporated a number of things that, I'm trying to touch on, okay? So first of all, one thing that you touched on, but you referenced the Catholic Church and the ministers, and you look at positions of authority. Sex offending is not new. That's the first thing. It has gone on for years between incest, between the power and control figures, child molesting. It has gone on for generations. The thing that is beginning to change, even though it's kind of ever-loving sweet time, but the things that have finally begun to change is that now people are telling. That's the difference. Because long before, in families, there may have been a particular perpetrator that everyone knew that was a family member. And the way that parents tried to protect their children was that you don't go around this person. But also what they did in protecting the offender was keeping it a secret within the family. Not the public, the family. Because there was a type of, that generation back in the day, this is family, whatever happens in the family stays in the family. And that's why you had so many years of incest going on, because no one would say anything. They might do preventative measures, keeping their children away from this person. But what that did was support the perpetrator into then finding other victims of people who weren't as diligent to do that. So until that changed, then you had years and years of perpetrating. Then when you talk about that thing about the Catholic Church that's changing, certainly staunch people in their religious faith, the pastor or the priest or whomever that may have been, they were kept in that sense of that a godly child and prophet would never do anything to hurt that family or the children. So it's kind of like, and when I think about how you were saying about the Catholic Church, the turning their heads, that kind of thing. They would simply move priests from when they had the allegations of abuse, move them to another church as though that would stop the situation as opposed to giving them access to further victims. But in this day and age, as it's changing slowly but surely, now victims are coming out and saying, here's what happened. And only that I learned myself in the system of the justice system, when you say about a person being out. One of the things I learned especially about people who've offended against children, when it came to court cases, it became more important to the court system that they didn't victimize the child anymore. Because remember, in law, the accuser is supposed to be able face to face to meet that person that offended them to say, this is what they did. That was the right that anybody accused of anything, they had to right to meet that accuser. Okay? Or to challenge that accuser about what happened. That's what our court system was based on. However, because we know that children are vulnerable, they've already been traumatized. If the perpetrator pleads guilty, that saves the child from having to go to court. It's not anything that's a favor for the perpetrator. That was to ensure that the child is not victimized anymore by having to sit there and look at that person who may have been a father or their mother, that they could feel that, I'm sending this person away to prison. That was the purpose of that, of the plea agreements per se. Now, the thing about feeling as the parent of children that you don't have a right, you do, and you were actually saying it, because the very number one thing that parents can do is understand facts. Like the fact that 1 in 10 children are sexually abused before they're 18. And that 90% of the perpetrators are people that they know. If you think about it, in our past, what have we always been taught about strangers? You don't, it's the strangers that can do something to you, so you don't just go up talking to anyone, because you don't know what they might do. But when in reality, it's more likely the victim knows who the perpetrator is, a family member, okay, or a neighbor. So the very first thing in understanding the facts about offending is important, because when you understand the facts, then that leads the parent to do exactly what you just said, which is, if you read the registry and you know that there are sex offenders who live around this area where the children catch the bus, you got to remember, in the sex offender registry, the goal is that that person cannot live 1,000 feet from a school, not a bus stop. Okay? Right. So in that sense, it's the parent's responsibility, based on what they know and understand, to protect their child. And how do they do it? They're right out there on the bus stop with them. When they know that there are sex offenders living in their area, because they have to live somewhere once they're released. And it's difficult, because I think if you look at any aspect, it's not just schools that they have to be 1,000 feet from. It's any type of facilities where kids congregate. So if there are daycares, there are churches that have daycares, there are YMCAs that have the before, after school programs. They can't be 1,000 feet live or reside within the areas of those establishments where kids go. So I think if they could include bus stops, they might have, but it didn't work like that because they're already limited as to where they can be. But it is the responsibility of the adult, the parent, to be diligent, just like what you were saying. It might feel like an inconvenience, but I know my child's going to be protected because I'm standing right out here at the bus stop with them. And then that thing about knowing that offenders live around in the area and they're walking about freely. Now here's where it comes in that sense of the parent. Since I know that, then I'm going to know where my child is. And I think that's the part that you're saying. That, if they're out, before, if it's getting dark, where are you supposed to be at,
But it's no longer limited to getting dark. I mean,
no,
if you
it can be.
Angela Renfro, who says at 3 years old, I was snatched from right in front of my house.
We've had recent cases of that. Yeah, right in front of broad daylight. But the thing of it is, it wasn't necessarily, and I'm not, be that it doesn't make it right, wrong, or indifferent. But the thing of it is, sometimes when it's about the kidnapping of children, it's not always about sex offending. It's about money, right? It's about, you've got people kidnapping kids to use in the labor force, sexual force, any kind of thing that, someone can make money off the use of kids, but be estimated that's criminal behavior. You're right. We don't know who's out there, but we know that if it's a matter of being diligent about how do you protect kids, you have to be aware of the facts. You have to minimize the access that somebody would have to be able to grab kids or whatever. There needs to be an adult person out there who's watching when the bus comes home, whatever, depending on where their situation is. And you also got to be aware of signs. It's like you're doing all the things that you needed to do in order to ensure the protection of your child, but you can't erase someone, because here's the other thing that I think it's important to understand when we talk about sex offenders, because that's the difficult aspect about it. A sex offender can be anyone It can be a family member, it can be a teacher, it can be a cop, it can be anyone. And the thing of it is, so in that sense, people have engaged in bad behaviors, criminal behaviors, and if that is not addressed, and people can also change. In addiction, people in recovery, it's almost a given, and we know they've stole from family members, took money to get drugs, done anything like that, and as long as they didn't take responsibility for that behavior, they stayed engaged in that behavior, no matter what the outcomes or what that may have been. For a sex offender, same thing. It's a matter of when they acknowledge and take responsibility for the devastating impact that they've had on somebody and how this affected their families, the victims' families, empathy, okay? Because unless they can develop that, and that's what they go through in treatment, the taking responsibility, identifying what their distortions were, empathy, and understanding the impact, and then to be able to then change that aspect where they don't put themselves in high-risk situation where they can be tempted to do anything. That's the thing that individual has to do. And it was interesting to me that people, and I mean, a lot of people feel the same way that you do. They have a difficult time with that aspect if it's been a personal situation in their life that they've experienced. But it was interesting to me when I was working with the sex offenders on parole. And every other month, like they would have groups every week with what they were dealing with, but the people who supported them, that spouse that stayed with them, and feeling like they were left out because how could you stay with a sex offender? But then that was part of the support system to hold him accountable in addition to himself. And if you lose that and you don't have anything like that, that puts them more at risk to offend.
Okay, so we have, I guess, 3 minutes. Go through the characteristics we need to look for in a sex offender or in someone that preys on kids, period. Sex offender, pedophile.
Or just depending on whoever. I think it's important in looking at the high risk, the situations, the behavior of the child, how are they acting around this person? Have they changed their behaviors in any way? Are they having issues in school? Whatever. And, certainly I would be looking at those types of behavior. And for the offender, that person who, in any other sense, why are they so wanting to be so helpful for your children and they're not with anybody else? That's not typical of them. I would certainly be looking at that situation of that person.
We discussed a lot in part 1 and part 2. And the discussion we'll continue simply in our mind, have the discussion. I have the discussion frequently with the boys. I don't know why I have it more with the boys. Has anybody ever touched you? Do you feel uncomfortable around anybody? I have it on a consistent basis, just simply because maybe call it paranoia, I don't know, but in trying to make sure that they are protected and that are safe. And so have those conversations, open it up, be mindful, watch your kids, watch for them being uncomfortable, watch for things that are different, watch for them pulling away from somebody, watch for them cringing when somebody touches them. Don't leave your kids alone with somebody new, a new boyfriend, a new mate, okay? Those kind of things, and you can always contact me on my website. It hasn't changed, www.claudettemilner.com, and of course we'll make information available to you, and email me and say I got a question, and that will be. But as we close out on this topic, this particular topic, it has been my efforts plus God's grace. This is Claudette Milner, host of A Matter of Interpretatin, Crisis in America. Be blessed.